I threatened her with no lunch, no dinner, no Christmas, no birthday parties for 2, 3, 4 years. I told her to stop being lazy, cowardly, self-indulgent, and pathetic. The house became a war zone, and I lost my voice yelling, but still, there seemed to be only negative progress. Children on their own never want to work, which is why it is crucial to override their preferences. These harsh, critical, biting words are ones by Amy Chua, professor of law at Yale Law School, and the author behind the term Tiger Mother, which describes a style of hyper-strict parenting in which mothers are highly invested in ensuring their children's successes at any cost. And in extreme cases for some, this means living apart from their families so that their children can study abroad at the most prestigious music programs, such as the Juilliard School's pre-college division. In some cases, even Asian doctors put their clinical practice on hold to further their children's musical studies. These characteristics of sacrifice, pushiness, determination have increasingly become tied with the Asian ethnicity. Now, why is that? According to Grace Wong, associate professor of American Studies at UC Davis, Asian parents perceive Western cultural norms and capital as yielding the highest forms of recognition on an international stage. The pursuit of classical music has ties to a form of cultural capital and eager assimilation into white culture. In other words, upward mobility. Yayoi Everett, professor at the School of Theater and Music at University of Illinois at Chicago, observes, modernizing East Asian nations legitimized and embraced Western art music as a marker of status, along with their commodification of the Western lifestyle. Concert halls and professional symphony orchestras function as visible symbols of the economic growth of the region and of the growing middle class able to patronize these performances. Additionally, it's the underlying belief that traditional values like discipline, diligence, and persistence translate directly into socioeconomic success and are critical reasons for enrolling their children into music lessons. So from here, classical music is tied to socioeconomic mobility and growth, with children gaining the skills and prestige necessary to enter higher culture. It's incredibly easy to point to classical music as a display of overcoming racial and cultural boundaries, with Asian Americans embodying the model minority myth as they rise in social structures through hard work without posing a direct challenge to the economic and political status quo. However, the unfortunate case is that Asian musicians are racially marked in ways that white musicians are not. Let's take a look at San Francisco County, which has an especially high concentration of Asians, 30.8% of the population to be exact. At the San Francisco Conservatory Preparatory Division, roughly half of the students are Asian. However, the numbers drop off dramatically at the more advanced levels of musical careers. At UC Berkeley, 41% of the student population is Asian, compared to the 31% white, yet Asians consist of only 7.9% of the arts and humanities faculty, and none of the music faculty is Asian. Is this simply a cultural phenomenon in which Asians are less likely to pursue these careers, or is there something else at play here? Could it be that there's barriers to entry for Asian Americans in a field that is traditionally seen as a meritocracy? Introducing Catherine Chan, an Asian American active in the musical scene of Boston, helping to increase exposure to underrepresented Asian Americans in classical music through sponsored performances. Catherine Chan was born in Taiwan and moved to the United States in 1967. She first worked at Boston University's medical school, and in 1972, Chan graduated from Berkeley with a PhD in biochemistry. Subsequently, Chan returned to Boston and volunteered with the Greater Boston Chinese Cultural Association, editing newspaper publications and organizing concerts, and eventually becoming executive director. Seeing the difficulty within the organization to mobilize resources, she started her own initiative to provide Chinese performers with a proper place to perform, she tells in an oral history with Harvard University. Still continuing to this day, her foundation allows talented upcoming artists to premiere their musical compositions and performances in an environment where their work is typically overlooked. Chan first saw the need for more talented Chinese or Asian musicians to be showcased in 1987 when violinist Nai Yuanhu, the first prize winner of the internationally renowned Queen Elizabeth competition, could only find venues with high school orchestra students at Newton High School. She wanted to present talented artists in a more professional way, giving them opportunities to perform in venues such as the New England Conservatory's Jordan Hall, not to promote Asian artists among Asians, but to establish a career in mainstream classical media. However, she quickly found that this would be no easy task, especially in terms of funding. The government would disregard her project in favor of more community-based initiatives, such as security for refugee groups or giving free music lessons to public schools. Music conservatories turned her away, seeing as they were also struggling financially. And finally, private businesses had their own agendas, as they were only interested in large, crowd-pleasing projects, rather than the seemingly niche classical music. Chan realized that without donors, her foundation would quickly run out of funds, with each concert costing around $3,000. Clearly, she had a long road ahead of her. For context, however, let's go way back, all the way to the beginning of this road, to the inception of classical music in Asian culture. And interestingly enough, it's not as far back as one might think. It's incredibly easy to think of classical music as a timeless form of art stretching back eons, a staple of high-class culture. Yet Western instruments only found their way to Asia just under 2 centuries ago. In Japan, it started with Commodore Matthew Perry's forcible entry in 1853. Political and military leaders were impressed by the use of military bands by American fleets, deciding to adopt them in their own army to increase discipline and morale. The Satsuma clan formed Japan's first brass band in 1869 and founded the National Military Band 2 years later. Similar accounts in China after the 1839 Opium War and Korea during the 1880s resulted in unprecedented exposure to classical music in Asia. Western missionaries also introduced organ music and choral singing during this time, and their schools taught forms of singing, music theory, and piano. As seen here, classical music was shaped by socio-political factors and globalization rather than cultural factors. By the late 1950s, Asian musicians began to win major international competitions and perform around the world. Seiji Ozawa won the International Competition of Orchestra Conductors, and in the following years, he became the assistant conductor for the New York Philharmonic, music director for the Toronto Symphony and San Francisco, and finally settling down at the Boston Symphony Orchestra for the following 3 decades as the music director. By this time, Asia was beginning to work its way into the global classical music scene. The Suzuki method, a music curriculum that is still widely practiced in America to this day, gained immense popularity around this time. When visiting Japan in 1979, President Jimmy Carter stepped out of Air Force One with his wife and daughter Amy, who was carrying a violin case. He bonded with Japanese citizens by saying that his daughter was undergoing lessons to the Suzuki method, illustrating how this curriculum had gained massive respect and popularity in the US and globally. Little did Japanese citizens know that the American press was using highly racialized and xenophobic rhetoric to describe the spread of classical music to Asia. The following excerpt is a direct quote from the 1967 Times article titled "Instrumentalists: Invasion from the Orient." Until recently, the idea of Orientals performing Western music seemed about as freakish as Heifetz playing the one-string ichigenkin. Now all that has changed. In the past few years, American and European concert halls have experienced something close to a full-scale invasion by talented Korean and Japanese musicians. With such prejudice and Orientalism in mind, let's take a deep dive into the underlying anti-Asian racism in classical music. Underrepresented usually isn't the word that people associate with Asian classical musicians. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. One might assume that classical music is based on a culture of meritocracy, that whoever plays the best is the most recognized. According to Mari Yoshihara, professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaii, especially in the American orchestra world, where most auditions are conducted behind a curtain, The faith in meritocracy, that it's the chops and nothing else that matters, prevails. Simply looking at the numbers, that could very well be a logical conclusion. In the 2002 International Tchaikovsky competition, well over half of the 55 piano contestants and nearly half of the 46 violin contestants were Asian. At prestigious music conservatories, they consist of a disproportionately high percentage of the student body. In 2003, about 30% of Juilliard students were Asian. In the New York Philharmonic, the percentage of Asians can also be as high as 30%, and even almost 2/3 of the violin section. And considering their demographic of 6% of the American population, it's seemingly reasonable to counter claims of racism by referring to Asians' disproportionate numerical success. These claims are exactly in line with the pernicious model minority myth within America. So if Asians can overcome racial barriers with their hard work, diligence, and collective achievement, then do these hurdles really exist in the first place for any minorities at all? Seemingly, racism can be countered by individual efforts if musicians can just work hard and be the best. To truly understand the underlying racism and elitism in classical music, we must look past the numbers and instead towards the attitude of classical music itself, towards those it deems to be outsiders. In Yoshihara's words, the notion that Asians are overrepresented in classical music conflates numbers with voice, power, and influence. Despite and sometimes because of their numerical presence, many Asian musicians experience maltreatment or marginalization in their professional lives. Such experiences range from everyday microaggressions to blatantly racist remarks about their heritage or unwanted sexual advances and harassment. Such voices are often dismissed with the claim that the number of Asians in American orchestras is proof of the lack of discrimination against them, and show that the Asian classical musicians are a privileged class whose grievances are unwarranted. However, according to Eileen M. Hayes, a chair of the Department of Music at Towson University, while East musicians grace some of the biggest concert stages, the musical language of classical music itself remains unchanged. Diversity in classical music is about inviting in different languages of composition, and the canon is still Eurocentric. He mentions a notable Asian music scholar decorated with a portfolio of award-winning books, numerous articles, and public presentations being questioned on accounts of her English language usage, her claim to a US citizenship, and her classroom authority, a repeated pattern throughout classical music culture that suggests ethnic and gender bias. During all of my research on the topic, there's a common theme throughout racist remarks against Asians: the fact that there's an underlying lack of understanding behind their expression on the basis of their geographic separation from the Eurocentric origin of classical music. In a virtual masterclass at the Juilliard School, internationally esteemed violinist Pinchas Zuckerman commented to two young violinists that their playing was almost too perfect and needed a little more vinegar or soy sauce, saying, "I know in Korea they don't sing." When one of the sisters spoke up, saying that they were in fact half Japanese, he responded by mimicking a quote-unquote Asian sing-song vocal style. Although a very extreme account, this is not an isolated incident, with many Asian musicians speaking up of similarly offensive comments by their mentors and audiences after this incident. The problem is that with the successes of accomplished musicians like Yo-Yo Ma, Midori, Sarah Chang, Lang Lang, Yu Wang, the model minority myth pervades the culture itself, invalidating the systemic struggles that Asian musicians must overcome. In the documentary From Mao to Mozart, Isaac Stern in China, which won an Oscar in 1980, the world-renowned Jewish American violinist visited China following the Cultural Revolution. In this film, he states that the Chinese musicians' approach to Western classical music is somewhat limited. They're not accustomed to playing with passion and a variety of color. They have an old-fashioned, technical approach towards the manner in which they play their instruments. They have not the experience of living with Western music for hundreds of years as we have. Essentially, he He's shown as a certain type of savior figure, exposing the ignorant Asian people to the knowledge of the Westerners. There's a certain caveat, or underlying assumption, to Asian musicians, a certain racial understanding of a fundamental genetic difference, or geographic difference, that Asians were meant to play Asian music and nothing else. According to Yoshihara, racial and ethnic background is synonymous with national identification, cultural knowledge, and musical expertise. A Korean American violinist playing a traditional Korean song would supposedly convey a deep, instinctive connection to the spirit of the piece that is different from her playing of Shostakovich, dismissing those who were raised in Western countries and grew up in the same environment as their white counterparts. However, to truly resist stereotyping and dismissing the achievements of hard-working musicians, we must see Asian musicians as individuals rather than a homogeneous group of people. There's a certain impression of a dichotomy between Asian and Western musicians, that while Asians have the perfect technique and mechanics, Westerners have the heart, the beauty, and fundamental emotional understanding of the music. According to violinist Young Kim, when I play in Europe, people still say things like, "As an Oriental, how can you understand Mozart or Brahms?" The adjective Asian itself has negative connotations in classical music. Think about how musical scholars say that there's something Germanic about Beethoven, French about Debussy, Russian about Rachmaninoff, characteristics that an Asian musician would never be able to capture, characteristics that are seen as grand, bold, powerful. Yet when we come across Asian as an adjective, it's an insult, where they have an assembly line mentality even towards music. Midori, an internationally renowned violinist, discusses the hierarchical distinctions between our musical languages, saying how when we hear someone play, we might say, "Oh, that sounds so German," and inherently we hear that as very positive, masculine, or robust. Whereas if we hear that someone sounds Asian, we think of that as completely negative. What's more, studies have shown that listeners, even musical experts, have visual components to their hearing. Wang covers a study in which 88 music teachers were shown videotapes of trumpet and flute students and asked to evaluate their performances. As the videos were synchronized to identical audios, the only changing variables were the instrument, gender, and race of the performers. The music teachers scored the performances of women lower than men, female trumpeters lower than female flutists, and black peoples significantly lower than white peoples. Despite identical audios, racial prejudices will always come into play in people's perception of music. In other words, Asian musicians and other minorities are at an inherently different playing field, even before they touch their instrument. According to music scholar Nancy Rao Rao, the extra burden that Asian musicians must face, despite their outstanding musicianship, is their additional ability to interpret European repertoire as authoritatively as their white counterparts. Some composers, such as Francis Wang, will understandably refuse to characterize their work or themselves as Asian in an effort to escape this factor. According to Joseph S.C. Lamb, a professor of musicology at the University of Michigan, industry giants like BMG and Sony see no urgency in promoting Asian American musicians and products. Exceptional individuals like Yo-Yo Ma, Chao Liang Lin, and Sarah Chang are promoted as master musicians rather than Asian American musicians. This narrative is a manifestation of Western fear or resentment of Asian success, acknowledging their achievements while still differentiating them from the mainstream and essentially invalidating their successes. It calls into question the concept of racial triangulation, a concept coined by Claire Jean Kim. The theme of having a high degree of technique while lacking the innate instinct required for true musicianship puts Asian musicians in the same exact position as they always are, considered part of the model minority, never fully assimilated into the place they call home. Instead, Asian musicians are forced into a type of musical bourgeoisie where they have the technique to be employed in these orchestras and have representation in numbers, yet lack the instinctive musical knowledge and prestige to enter the upper echelons. They're mechanically successful, allowing them to win competitions, but according to society, their merits do not extend to the world of executive positions of musical interpretation or understanding. There's also the problem of Orientalism, the characterization of Asians as exotic, homogenous, alien outsiders. Whereas white musicians are regarded individually, Asian musicians are generally believed to have the same characteristics as previously outlined. This makes it increasingly difficult to stand out when all Asian musicians are subconsciously regarded as identically lacking. While Asian musicians is a broad term describing people with diverse origins, languages, backgrounds, identities, and experiences, Orientalism categorizes them into a single group, one that is viewed condescendingly by those in power. They're all assumed to play the same way with little emotional depth, but technical precision. Their integration, as such, is met with varying amounts of shock and pushbacks. Focusing on the represented, prestigious Asian musicians, too, takes away from the struggling portion, the quarter of which have annual household incomes below $40,000. Orientalism, racial triangulation, and the model minority myth pervade all aspects of society, and classical music is no exception. In fact, the percentage of Asians with decision-making power in the world of music, such as conductors, administrators, staff, executives, are far lower at only 2% of all demographics. So where is that overrepresentation now? It's clear that there's a glass ceiling in Asian achievement in classical music, both in terms of reputation and executive positions, exemplified by the few Asian deans of music schools in the United States. In 2017, the Cleveland Institute of Music appointed Judy Iwanabundra, a noted scholar of music education, as dean and the first chief academic officer, who ended up sharing that she continues to experience racially fueled comments while in public. According to Yoshihara, less than 8% of orchestra board members are non-white, including 3 to 4% African American and 1 to 2% Hispanic/Latino. And the number of Asians is far too small to even be disaggregated in that data. In other words, Asian musicians have been given a place insofar as they are dutiful performers of music written and programmed by others, yet rarely have been sought out for their own creative visions or voices. So while the numbers do show a representation of Asian Americans in classical music, it does not support a dominance of Asian Americans in the classical music industry, nor does it illustrate an inherent advantage. Most definitely, it does not refute the notion that Asian musicians face racism in classical music. Now, this isn't to say that there's no hope at all for Asian musicians. With classical music being a new phenomenon in Asian countries compared to other cultures, there's still much progress to be made, and progress in the past that we're able to measure.
Another aspect of that double stream of art I mentioned earlier, flowing into and out of America, has long been the attraction of our country to foreign artists and scientists and thinkers who have come not only to visit us, but often to join us as Americans, to become citizens of what to some has historically been the land of opportunity, and to others the land of freedom. And in this great tradition, there has come to us this year a young man aged 7, bearing the name Yo-Yo Ma.
Let's take a look at Catherine Chan's progress. From her foundation's inception in the late 1980s, she's been able to raise $35,000 annually until 2018. Through her fundraising and campaigns, she's been able to collaborate with the New England Conservatory's Jordan Hall, premiering the works of 7 graduate students at Columbia University at the time, 3 of which, Tan Zhuang, Cheng Yi, Zhou Long, have won prestigious international awards ever since, including the Pulitzer Prize for Music and the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts. You might recognize the film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, whose award-winning score was composed by the very Tan Zhuang, for which he received an Academy Award, a Grammy Award, and a British Academy Film Award. Her concerts have featured Yo-Yo Ma, international cellist, and Wu Man, a bebop player who was later featured at the White House and in the New York Times. She's organized 3 international conferences on Chinese music, bridging established world-renowned composers with talented up-and-coming Chinese composers. That is to say, our future is bright, and our future is hopeful.